What happens to a job when its tasks are exposed to AI? And why does the order in which tasks get automated matter just as much as which tasks get automated at all? My guest today is Daniel Rock, an assistant professor at the Wharton School and a co-founder of Work Helix. His research focuses on how technology changed the nature of work within firms and the economy at large. Here's our talk. Welcome to the Economics of Work. I'm excited to welcome Daniel Rock, assistant professor at Penn, co-founder of Work Helix. We'll talk more about Work Helix, but most importantly, the person that I call if I want to work through a half-baked idea. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Great to talk with you, man.
Yeah, for sure. Let's start with exposure, AI exposure. What exactly is exposure? How should we think about it?
AI exposure is a limited thing. It's a very limited thing. It just means broadly, like it's the first question, what's exposed? So it could be a task, it could be a job, it could be a system.
Oh, jobs can be exposed? Yeah, what would that even mean? Like I understand like the exposure of tasks. That makes sense. Is the exposure of a job really even like a meaningful concept?
It can be. So the exposure for a task means that the task has potential to be changed with AI. Or you can broadly pick any technology and say, does that task have exposure? Could it be changed by that technology? You just need a decent way of generating the measure. The exposure of a job, similarly, is could the job be changed with the use of AI? And while I agree with you, that's like a little bit less of a meaningful concept if you can't point to like what does that mean for that job to be changed, but for the tasks underneath it, you might have like a summary measure at the job level to say like there's a lot that this person should be doing using AI. So to the extent that there's like someone with agency making choices about how they do their work at the job level, they will pick certain things to do with AI and pick ways to allocate their time across tasks. Exposure I think is often misconstrued with automation, and that's one where I often have to correct people to say like, no, these exposure scores, the ones I've worked on, the ones that others have worked on, they don't correspond to automation on its own. And that sort of measure is much more difficult to create, if at all possible, right?
Well, okay, so let me take the pro automation position just to play with it. So I totally get that like interpreting the exposure at some aggregate level like a job would definitely not translate to automation of that job. But like let's say you had tasks at a very, very, very granular level.
hmm
Could you then interpret it as automation? Like even if you think of a task as being supported by AI, isn't that really just like kind of automating one little component of it and like complementing the remaining component of it? Like, yeah, how should we think through how we could interpret exposure? Like, do you think we could interpret exposure as automation if it were done at a granular enough level?
Yeah. Okay. So this is where the what you are rating and what exposure means are kind of jointly determined and very difficult to separate.
Yeah.
I very much agree with what you said, but I want to be very specific about how I agree with you.
Okay.
If we keep blasting the task apart into more and more and more subtasks to the point where you've gone down to the studs of like, I'm going to type, it's like move finger to touch, key or something.
Yeah.
Then I agree if you're talking about exposure to say like, a typing robot. And that's what roboticists often have to do, right? They have to like figure out what is the really precise thing that this thing is going to have to do. Then we're talking about automation. When we're at the level of a task taxonomy like you guys have made or ONET or something, that is an aggregate of a few different tasks that are of the, move finger to touch keyboard kind. And, once you've gotten to that stage, then it's a mixture, as the post-humanist sociology crew might call it, it's an assemblage. Shout out to David Holtz and Avi Collis, who will find
Ooh,
that.
I like that word. I'm gonna copy
Yeah, the
assemblage.
assemblage.
Yeah.
And there's this old idea, not to get too deep into it, but it's like an army is not a pile of soldiers, a pile of uniforms, and a pile of tanks. It's like a bunch of people operating together with affordances and constraints, as I learned in grad school. So once you're at an aggregated level, now you've got a system again, and at that point, it's not automation, at least not clearly.
Yeah, okay. I really like this idea of assemblage, and I wanna like I feel like there's a few papers on like the nature of assembly, if we want to think about it that way, that I want to like gauge your thoughts on.
Not where I expected to go today, talking about
No,
but
it's
yeah,
it's
it's
a
fun.
it's a cool subtopic. Let's say, we have these like super micro subtasks of like move finger. Like that seems like clearly not useful as like the atomical unit of a task.
Right.
Yeah, so I just want to think like what do you think is the right like if we want to manage tasks and how they fit together, here's two ways that I would think of like what is the right like granularity. One is like just what technology can affect wholesale. So maybe one way to think about it is just like if AI is affecting part of something and not the other part, then that is in and of itself enough of a determination that that workflow, that set of tasks should be split. That's one thought. Another thought is like I'm thinking of like weak bundles, strong bundles,
Sure. Yeah. Great paper.
where, if you have some subtasks or some tasks that so obviously should be together that it would be so costly to unbundle them, then they should just be together. And, we should think of tasks as being distinct insofar as unbundling is just too costly. And maybe that's a good way to think about a task. I don't know. What do you make of it? Like, do you think there is like a right number of tasks in the world that we should have?
No, no. I'm increasingly of this this perspective that Tim Bresnahan has put forth of like the systems-based view. Then folks at Toronto, Christina McElhern, Avi Goldfarb, Jay Agrawal, Joshua Gans, like sort of usual suspects to some degree. I'm starting to think more that like the organizational economics and task determination like combo, like using the org econ toolkit to understand like how different types of jobs and tasks fit together is really where all the interesting action is. So there are some like macro models, like the task-based model, or like even like thinking about ordinary labor demand task models, like Cobb Douglas style things or CES style things. I think that's really useful. Like papers like Otter Levy Murnane, Classic, kick off a whole literature and get you quite a lot of like understanding for different trade-offs. But then it sort of falls short in certain places. Like if I augment someone and they do the job of 10 people, does that mean that we're hiring more or fewer? Well, you can't really answer that with a task-based approach on its own. You need more. Likewise, if I automate some part of a weak bundled job and then they start focusing on the strong bundled residual component, like the relational stuff that Alex Emas or Luis Garicano have been writing about recently. If you start thinking about it that way, then it's like, well, automation or augmentation could lead to really big shifts in either direction for labor demand, or not much of a shift at all, depending. And now it's like, okay, well, it's the organizational context that's going to drive the differences, and that's where like the systems view really comes in. There's a paper I love that came out recently. It's by Mert DeMeyer, John Horton.
Oh, task chaining?
Yeah, chaining tasks. Payman Shahidi just presented it at our Wharton Future of Work conference and did a fantastic job. It's my
Yeah.
favorite paper we had on the agenda. It just like completely changed how I think about things. So
I also love that paper. It's so cool because I mean, I think it's the first one that shows not only that the aggregation function, or I think about it like the aggregation function of
right.
like tasks to jobs matters, but also the sequence determines how we should think about aggregating those or assembling those.
Right. Yeah. And then you get this idea that's really neat where if I can put multiple AI driven tasks in a row, then maybe my validation step can cover all of them and I pay fixed costs like to validate once. I just thought that resonated so much with all the stuff I'm doing with like Codex, Cloud Code, Gemini command line. Like I'm like running all of them at once and I'm having them check each other's work. And there is like a cognitive overhead to going and checking on each different stage as opposed to having like a more coherent testing strategy that runs at the end. And if you can figure out the coherent testing strategy that runs at the end, like you just saved yourself, hours of time on something that's already cut down from months to like a couple days, which is maybe I'm being greedy. I'm like I don't want to,
Yeah.
it's not just that I want my months cut to days, I want my days cut to hours.
Yeah. There's no shortage of stuff to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that paper, and there is going to be a series of papers, is my guess, with the weak bundle, strong bundle paper, kind of establishing a new wave of producer theory that blends org econ insights. Another great example of this, Enrique Ide and Eduard Talamas have a series of papers, most of them with each other, but then there's some that they're writing individually that all kind of fit in this literature, and I think it's like a new labor org econ hybrid that's really exciting as a new area of research.
It sounds very exciting. My critique on the task chaining idea, and I mentioned this to Payman and John Horton, so not throwing shade. That like even though I'm sympathetic to the idea that like clustering automatable things together allows you to like modularize that and say like if you offload 10, let's say 10 tasks, if you offload 2 4 6 8, then there's a lot more, obviously, there's a lot more like tracking and like human overhead. And if you automate 4 5 6 7, like that's less human involvement. But the thing I'm like a little less convinced on is whether that human involvement is just a cost. Like if you are checking in on steps 2, 4, 6, 8, and you have to like be there in the beginning and the end, and you have these handoff costs. There are also handoff benefits that I think could also kind of be interesting.
Tell me about that. Yeah, handoffs are usually a pain. I would love to hear what the.
Yeah. I mean, obviously depends on workflow. Like, there is some handoffs that I really don't like. But, if I think about like building a statistical model, I really like being able to trace exactly what it's doing at each step and like doing some deconstruction along the way, be able to like, see where it is at some intermediate step in the model and like just see that it's behaving. And then if it's like misbehaving, then I could be like, oh, well, this is like some step that's broken. But if it's behaving, then I'm like, okay, good, ready to go on to the next step. And even though that's like totally unnecessary, like you could throw something into a complex model and it'll just work. Personally, I really like breaking that model into like different parts of the sequence just to kind of like understand it, because then I think explaining becomes easier. And just like if it is misbehaving, which it always does, you kind of like know where. So I don't know. I think that's helpful. And I wonder if that just gives us more. I don't know. I mean, everyone's got different styles of work, but that is a style of work that I think could be a productive style.
I think you bring up a really interesting point and a valuable one. That it's all right. So it's silent in the model, but in the chaining task model, but it's also sort of a different paper. As you do this, like with any process, right? With any work process, there it serves two functions for knowledge workers, at least two functions. I'm probably, don't get mad at me, folks listening who where I've missed your favorite one. But there's a knowledge generation and a judgment and taste generation process. Like, lump it all under human capital where you're generating. And I'll shout out your data right now. I am, as we've discussed, so I am training large language models, fine tuning them with Revelio job postings data. We're going to open source them once they're ready. They're encoders. One of the things that we can show, right, is that contrastive loss is really important. Like that gets you much better, much more meaningful embeddings if you're
What do you
vector.
mean contrastive loss?
So what I want to do is not just like the initial pre-training fine-tuning step where like I fine-tune, like one of the things we did, fine-tuning modern BERT. And then like downstream, what we might use that for, we create embeddings, we push the job posting through modern BERT, we get this like set of vectors. And that set of vectors, how do we evaluate if they picked up job content? Well, one way is to look at like the Revelio taxonomy, say the K250, I think level, and see like, does it predict what this, tag was? Or we look at ONET, does it predict the right ONET tag? Or we predict the salary and like, what's the R squared on that, right? Like 3 different eval tests you can do. Modern BERT is like the earlier step in a model. Like you can stop there at that kind of fine tuning. Or you can take another step, which is to say, like this, if I were to say, submit a query that said, I don't know, dredge operator, and then I have text that comes with dredge operator from like a posting, like that's a positive pair. But if I see dredge operator and then there's like a whole bunch of content that has nothing to do with dredge operator, or it's very close to dredge operator, but clearly not, like those are negative examples. And I also want to say, like, push those things away from each other in this space. That's like a contrastive loss.
Yeah.
And that works way better. Why does it work way better? Well, Cowan Yaraj, he's at U Chicago. He has this paper from like 2019 in EMNLP talking about how embeddings are what you'd call an isotropic. That is, the space is warped a little bit. The distances are not maintained. So BERT has like an isotropic, embeddings. If you had your recipe space and your distances between recipes in that BERT space are going to be maybe consistent, and then distances between jobs might be consistent. But if you try to compare distances between different recipes and different jobs, that cone is really strange.
Right. So you can't do this like king minus man plus woman equals queen algebra.
Yes,
Like that
exactly.
that have you ever been able to do that, or has that always been like kind of a lie?
So you can do this, but the thing you have to do is introduce some sort of regularization of the space. And that's
So you
where
can like linearize it somehow by aligning to something.
Cowan's paper has got some suggestions, but also contrastive loss sort of starts to solve this. And that's, one of the things that he and others have pointed out. To get back to the original point, like, okay, so I'm going on a rant about embeddings, which is very easy to get me to do.
Always a fun rant.
Yeah. What's the point of this from like why am I learning from this? Well, I am seeing as we're trading these things, like I'm picking up judgment with, my teammates. I'm picking up judgment about like what will work for this problem and like where the problem will break down, like what kinds of mistakes it will make. That will be useful for another project later, or for having intuition about how to fix things, change them for better use cases later. I don't need that to do this task. Like, I could just stick this in auto research and be like, build a good predictive model of this, and like the chaining task paper will cover that, but it won't cover the like what did I lose if I didn't introduce like that verification like breakdown. So you have to make that trade-off, but whatever. Mert and John, Pema, Nicole, like the whole team can go build another paper on top of this one that they've
Right,
got.
totally. I mean, what I like so much about the paper is that it's so extendable. Like, you could say, oh, you have some model of like, sequence mattering in this very specific way, and you could have another model where sequence matters in a very different way. And, you have
And
what?
Brennan Luzier, the one author I forgot to mention.
Ah, yeah.
Brennan.
So this idea of kind of this like org econ introduction to the space is so exciting. I mean, I know you told me a story years ago about how you were, your conversation with Joe Stiglitz.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
Did I tell that
I
story?
mean, yeah. What was that story exactly? And do you think we're like reaching a point where,
Yeah, this is like one of those highlights of a grad student's life, where there was a lunch at the Philadelphia, actually, the AEA annual conference, ASSA or whatever. And we were at Maggiano's of all places. And yeah, it was like to discuss, AI and the economy broadly. I sat down, there was an empty seat next to me, and Joe Stiglitz was invited. I didn't know that, but he was late. So of course, if you're gonna get stuck next to the grad student, the way to do it is to be late. I like sitting next to grad students. Maybe Joe enjoyed the conversation too. But I described what I was working on, and thinking about tasks and bundles of tasks as jobs. And he asked a question that I just didn't have an answer for at the time, but I thought it was so profound and useful. It was like, why are tasks bundled together into a job in the first place? What creates those bundles? And you can kind of hand wave and say coordination costs and the boundary of the job and think about transaction cost economics and so on. But like, I don't have a good way to operationalize that. Certainly not back then. I think actually the recent paper that Luis Garicano and his co-authors wrote starts to get you much closer, and it's really cool that that's there. But that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole for a while, like thinking about the task model and where it's useful and where it's not. So sometimes a chance encounter over some Italian food can lead you to somewhere fun.
yeah, I mean, do you think that in 5 years we will have, we as a discipline will have a really good answer to that question? Like, let's say, someone asks, like, how does work get determined? What is the process which results in a job? Is that something we can understand? We will be able to understand if you had to predict?
I think people will make progress toward that, but I don't think there will be a convincing, like, this is the be all end all, here's how it works. And the reason I think that, so it's a little amorphous, but jobs are equilibrium objects in their own. Like they're a negotiated sort of equilibrium, supply demand. And at the high level, it's like we settle on names for broad bundles of tasks as jobs, so people can be like, "Oh, this is what I do." If someone asks, like, "Oh, what do you do?" But then, like, what do you really do? That, like that old meme, like what my mom thinks I do, what I actually do, like that sort
Yeah,
of thing.
yeah.
I love that meme. I wish they bring it back. But like you get down to like what someone's actually doing every day, and that's like some sort of. I mean, some of the tools that you might see used are like sort of Nash bargaining over like what people like and what they get paid for, and coordination costs and what like all that kind of stuff. So you could write something down that sets a job boundary in theory, and then when it actually comes to understanding what has happened and making predictions about like how work will change and so on, ultimately it's going to be a mixture of tastes and skills and needs from the company. And I think that's just like too broad a set of things to be really perfect. Now, where I think you're going to have a lot of progress and what's really interesting is how do you aggregate up from what that Nash bargaining thing is doing, or whatever model people use, to the aggregate, like this is what I tell people I do thing. And there's some education in there, and there's like some mapping. If we can crack that one, where like this is how stuff gets categorized, and this is why I love your book, the taxonomies book. That's like taxonomies are a big piece of this, and they're objects that kind of impose structure in the world. The map becomes the terrain a little bit.
That second part sounds a little easier to me because people will say what is most descriptive, presumably, and that descriptiveness shows up on the internet. Even this idea of like this bargained object, this object that results from some bargaining process sounds like a really good start. Well, let me ask you. I mean, you also, are co-founder at Work Helix. You're like making stuff for the world. So one, I want to hear about Work Helix and like what you guys are doing and what's interesting. But like even before that, like it's a company and you like work with people to make stuff. How do you think work gets determined within your company?
Right. Well, so even that, there are, roles and responsibilities. There's things that we try to do in streamlined ways and processes we try to solve. Startups a very strange place to study this because you have so much like open connectivity between what people do. I mean, you know this, I'm sure, through Revelio in the early days versus how it is now. In the beginning, it's harder to say this person can only do this or like this person should be focused on that because there's just so much that needs to get done, and it's just like hot potato all over the place. And then what you like to do is solidify things and streamline them so that people can specialize and kind of play to their strengths. Because an earlier stage company is a harder place to understand like the solidified version of it, but it is a very good place to learn the process of phase transition, where you go from, it's everything all the time to like, oh, this is like my job. I think that's what a lot of people really like about startups, if that's like their taste, is like they like having more sort of general purpose capability or like being asked to do things that are tougher or first time things. But yeah, gradually, processes get solidified and you start doing the same thing as you find product market fit. So I think, the ideal scenario is you find product market fit on something, and then the customers and the product side of things start to govern what needs to be done. And once you know what needs to be done, then you can specialize the roles, and you have a little bit of flexibility around that to catch like sort of latent demand, as Boris Cherney would call it at Anthropic. They see a lot of latent demand in Claude Code, apparently. So then they're like, okay, this is what people are doing. We need to build features for this. But like, if you can get into that kind of flywheel where it's like collect information, adjust, then now all of a sudden you've got a more solidified structure for innovation. But I think for Work Helix, where we're trying to help people make AI go better broadly in their organization, help them optimize what's going well, expand it, learn where it's not going well, sort of have change management software to a degree, but also like understand how work is changing. That's a pretty broad set of things to work on. And then what we will actually do, showing people the value of the work that's going through, like some of those processes we know are valuable, and then we'll just keep repeating them.
Yeah. Well, having had a foot in startup land and in being an entrepreneur and being an academic, like what do you think entrepreneurs can learn from academics and what can academics learn from entrepreneurs?
Oh boy. That's I have to like organize my thoughts on that on the fly. It's a wonderful question. I've heard something from academics that like has a grain of truth to it, and then there's important places where I disagree, which is like being an academic is like being an entrepreneur where you have lots of little companies that you're starting. And those companies are papers, basically. That is in some sense true. The analog for product market fit is you're trying to find a paper that's high impact but fits within a literature as well, so that it's useful to other people. I think if you're not thinking about like what would be useful to my research community, it might be that the research community doesn't realize it yet, but like you're at least trying to say like I'm trying to educate folks on something that I'm learning through my research, or it falls on deaf ears, which is also not good. There's a demand side, and then it is the case that you have to be like self-motivated to generate this stuff, and you have to like really care about the outcomes and making sure the quality is as good as it possibly can be. So I see an analog there where I think a startup as a company, as opposed to as a paper, is a much more difficult object, and it's way tougher than any paper. So you can have like an entrepreneurial mindset, but the idea that, you're entering a competitive field and you're trying to discover something that people who are going to ideally pay you for something really need to get their work done or to make something useful happen within their organization. If you're doing like a B2B thing or like useful in their lives or entertaining at a minimum in the consumer side, that is much harder. If you write a paper and nobody reads it, it's a bummer for you, and that's a pretty limited cost, right? You might get a publication with only a couple citations. Oh well. If you start a company and nobody wants anything, that is much more costly, and you have to be sort of fanatical about really wanting that thing to exist in the world. So the stakes are just so much bigger, and also the requirements to serve those stakes are much, much higher. So it's a lot tougher. What entrepreneurs can maybe learn from academics, I see a lot of academics have sort of a portfolio approach to their projects. They see what's working, they see what's not. I think that experimentation gene is helpful for startups. There's a lot of ironically, there's a lot of academic literature on this, but like I think it's hard in some places to interpret signal through the noise, especially if, and that's kind of what you have to optimize for in the early days of a startup is like, how do I tell genuine signal from noise? And it's not easy. So, what some entrepreneurs, and there are others writing about this a lot, what some entrepreneurs can learn from this is to be scientific, to really test hypotheses, and then to be flexible about what evidence means, because it's not like you're going to have statistically large enough samples on most of what you're doing. You're going to have like 4 or 5 examples, and you're going to have to reason from them. So, that's a scientific method I think is useful from like a academic startup ease blend.
I think that makes sense. I like that idea. I mean, I think as an entrepreneur, I find it very hard to be kind of intellectually honest in a way where like you start a company and you have to like sell this idea to people who you want to join you on this journey. You have to sell to clients and you have to believe it's a bigger deal than it probably is. So, you need like a little bit of delusion. You need to be like kind of delusional in like
I don't think I'm delusional, Ben.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe you become delusional as you spend more time in it. I think there's a part of me that's a little bit delusional. Like I think people are like, "Oh, how big can this be?" And I'm like, "Oh, this is going to be a Fortune 500 company someday." And like, people are like, "Oh, okay, like let's, chill. Like that's, it's very low likelihood of that." And I'm like, "I don't know. Like
Turn it back to you. What do you think? I mean, you kind of have the same blend of experience, maybe weighted a little more one way versus the other, but what have you picked up?
I agree that like academia is a lot more entrepreneurial than I had expected it to be. I think, as a grad student, and I never really spent like time doing like proper academic, I was never like an insider in academia. But I mean, now I like work with a lot of academics and providing data and stuff like that. And I'm surprised by how much to be an academic researcher, you need to like work with vendors, you need to like, pitch the vision, you need to like find a team and co-authors, you need to like, there's like politicking, there's whatever, there's so much. You need to have some hustle and just like be business minded in a way that is like a really distinct set of skills than just like being a good writer and thinker and statistician and all these things. I'm like very impressed by what, successful academics are able to accomplish. It's like really a very varied job. One thing that's like more of a narrow idea that and I'm curious to hear your take on is kind of going back to this idea of like how work adapts. I think we're still a small company, and when a client has some need, we change around what people do. And when someone leaves the company, we change around what people do. We're constantly reconfiguring people's jobs. Every day there's something comes up and you say, who's the best person to take this on? Or this person doesn't really like this, or they're not really good at it, or whatever. And you're constantly like reconfiguring what people are doing. And when I hear that like AI is going to affect the task composition of the economy in a way that's going to be too fast to reconfigure, that just feels wrong because I just think reconfiguration happens all the time, every day, and 99% of the time it has nothing to do with technology. And so, if you have this like secular technological trend, that's just like kind of a small part of job transformation. I don't know. What do you think? Granted, I'm not like in Pfizer where like, everyone is like a cog in an assembly line.
hope, hope I, with apologies to Pfizer.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, no offense to Pfizer or like, some like very procedural organization.
The way I put it, because I talk with large companies, folks at large companies, I talk with folks at startups quite a bit. There's a natural tension when you have a big successful company to not blow up the money printer. And what we're seeing a lot of, I think, throughout the economy, and this will happen with any early stage, super transformative technology. I think AI is in that bucket. I think AI might be like electricity or bigger. I think that's in the support of the distribution here.
It's GPT as
Yeah,
we know.
it's a GPT, and then it's also, as some recent papers have pointed out, an invention and the method of innovation. So it can help us discover all sorts of cool things, like it turbocharges the discovery engine. And I'm hoping that just means TFB multiplication on the outside. So if you think that this technology is like other technologies that have been really transformative. The initial instinct is the same one you had with the steam engine and the electric dynamo. It's how do we retrofit our existing set of steps and processes so that we've sprinkled a little bit of AI magic into all of them and we get like a 30% improvement across a few. And that translates to nice productivity growth, but not transformative productivity growth. It's not quite as exciting as one would hope. And then there's a new type of business, an AI native business that is primarily in smaller firms, younger firms right now, but not only. I'm thinking of Strong DM, for example. They've talked a little bit about their build process and how much they get out of agentic coding systems. And it's astounding. They rebuild all sorts of software that they have no intention of selling. They just want to use it to test their products. And it's just like, unhinged things 10 years ago are now like table stakes for them to a degree. So what I think about is like this intersection between sort of the industrial organization econ and the org econ. Like, where will you have sufficient competitive pressure that retrofitting is not good enough and that you will get forced to start reconfiguring your processes? With a startup, you have to, like, they're more like putty. I mean, like, we think about a company like, Nike or Coca-Cola, or I'm picking things with like incredible brands that would be like you could replicate Coke and put it in a can with like, Zweig Cola on it or something, and people still wouldn't buy it even if it tasted the same, right? Like it's very
Right, right.
hard.
That would be a very naive way to think about what is the value chain of a company.
Exactly. So for them, you would think the incentives to shift to AI native might be not quite as strong, or like Nike, the same thing. I mean, maybe they are like aggressively pursuing it because they're like, there's all sorts of operational benefits we got, I don't know. I'm not inside these companies, but like you can build a theory around that where if you're like a little bit, if you have some great complementary assets, then maybe your money printer is safe for a while and you don't have to do like radical transformation.
I think this is a really interesting take. It kind of seems to be in a little bit of contrast to a wonderful paper I know from Daniel Rock about IT. So, in and correct me if I'm like misunderstanding this, but it seems like with IT, you had a lot of gains from dependency where, in order to like take advantage of like the latest and greatest in IT, you needed databases and like, network stuff and just like the building blocks. And then you can like take advantage. And it seems like you think with AI, not having dependency is like kind of a big strength. Like if you can just start from scratch,
I
you
would I
may.
would reconcile that conflict by saying you still need the complements, but you need them in different proportions. Like a startup is building the complements and can do it with the configuration that they want. But the incumbency advantage is that you have them installed already, so you can start moving on the existing market that you have. So it's a play on that. I think it's Clay Christensen. I'm not sure. You're trying to get distribution before your competitors get innovation on the startup side, and vice versa. But it's just like your incentives to innovate and like where you adopt and when you start blowing things up and like what you build in parallel as like a secondary system that looks new, like you might skunkworks, an AI version of your company. There's lots of ways that people have conceived of how to get that kind of innovation and incumbents, but that tension is very real for a lot of large organizations, and it's got cool interactions with the org econ ideas. Like let's think about high powered incentives, for example. Let's say I have a sales team and I incentivize them, with the standard like, here's your quota to sell the exact same thing that we've been building for the last 10 years. And then I also say you need to be AI native and totally radically change your performance or your use of technology at the same time. That takes time, and like people need a chance to learn what's going to work for them, what's not. It's very difficult if you have high powered incentives to divert your effort away from your focus on selling to focus on enabling yourself to sell more later. So now we need a new contract where for a little while it's like, I'm going to give you a day every 2 weeks to like upskill here, and then I want to see that you're hitting that mark as well as some of the sales stuff, and we give you a little bit of leeway. I don't think I've seen a ton of organizations being like super deliberate about that. There's a couple and they're doing great. I won't name them, but I've seen a few doing a really great job there.
Yeah, it's a cool idea. I mean, it's very much in conflict with this idea of, oh, AI is going to be a big deal, so we should like lay off a bunch of people
Yeah.
because then everyone has even less bandwidth to kind of try new things.
And it locks in your capital stack. So if I lay people off, then I'm depending on like automation or AI assisted capital formation to do the exact same thing I was doing before. You've killed your innovative capacity if you've taken all the slack out as cost savings, which is a signal, right? Like that's a signal that demand is not expanding for the thing that you're doing. It can be the right answer. I'm just, in many cases, it's not going to, I think that's a mistake that people make.
Yeah, that sounds right. I mean, one way that I sometimes wonder if AI is like different from other technologies, from other GPTs, is that it seems like it doesn't have a lot of dependencies where you can just like anyone who knows how to write to something can write with it, and that seems kind of new and interesting. And another is that it's different from this idea you were making about this company that's AI native, but it seems like AI is being designed to kind of fit within systems and like replace certain tasks. And that is like at least how the frontier AI companies talk about what they're trying to do. They say, we are designing something that can
Some of
like,
them do not, and I think they're changing their tune.
yeah, they're learning, I guess. But it still kind of has that vibe of something that is like a task automator technology. And I wonder if you think that it's different from other GPTs in that way. Like do you think this time is different in any like important ways?
I think it's emergent. There's been a lot of discussion on both sides of this one. I tend to take an optimistic view. There's amazing things we can do with these technologies. I don't know if you saw the stuff with the pancreatic cancer trial. I think I spend too much time on Twitter. So I'm not sure if this is verified or not. But there are other examples of things like this. So the 5-year prognosis for pancreatic cancer is not great. Most people pass away. My grandmother died from it. It's an awful disease. And apparently there was a trial with like an AI assisted design for an mRNA vaccine, I think. And again,
Oh, yes. Derek Thompson wrote something about this,
yeah,
right?
I think that might have been where I saw this. Yeah.
I only get I try to stay off Twitter, but I get like people that write Substacks about what showed up on Twitter.
Good filter mechanism. You don't want to go raw Twitter. Yeah, I mean, the people who are in that trial years later are alive, which like that's or there was this dude in Australia who wanted to cure his dog's skin cancer, and he went through all these troubles to try to get a vaccine synthesized, managed to do it, to his credit. The vaccine taught the dog's immune system to attack its cancer, which is like you see these things and you just get I find them deeply inspiring. Also, mildly infuriating, or very infuriating, that we don't have an immediate boom in like the provision of these sorts of things. And you start to think about like what bottlenecks to that exists and like what do they matter or not. I think there's an organizational sort of equivalent there where a lot of the AI transformation we'll see may not have anything to do with AI. It's just we're seeing a potential for change. We're going back and appraising the stuff that we're currently doing and saying, well, this makes sense and that doesn't. And, what I'd like to see is a little bit more around the optimism for what we can do with these and how that they can expand frontiers. We really shouldn't get caught up in a mindset of like what we do now is only things we'll ever do. It's going to change, like you say, over time. And I think it'll be like the labor market of Theseus, where we'll like gradually swap things out. And I think it's worth planning for where there will be disruptions, where there'll be inequities, and trying to help people who get displaced. But the majority of the story in the long run, I think, is going to be extraordinarily positive. Now, granted, that's a bias I have, and like I want any scientific work I do, I try to keep that at home, where it's like I want an honest appraisal of what's going on and how it works, and that's what I'm trying to put in my work. But I find it impossible to look at like these healthcare and biology advances with the assistance of AI in particular, but then also thinking about science generally or math, like the recent DeepMind results solving 9 Erdos problems. Like what is going on? Like we're seeing the green shoots, the early days of a complete golden age for science and technology. And I think if we manage it properly, it's going to be an extraordinary time. One that makes me a little bit sad that I'll probably not be around for the coolest long-term effects of it. But I don't know, maybe they'll figure out some longevity drug or something that doesn't turn us into zombies.
Yeah, we'll be able to upload our brain on something. Yeah, no, I mean, I think at some point, like what you would at one point consider a bias. The more time you spend in this becomes an informed opinion. So I wouldn't consider that a bias. So final question for you is, I think of you as like existing in a few different places. Like you're East Coast academic, but you've also got like you're an insider in West Coast startup land, and also I think you are embedded in those networks also, and you kind of see how people are thinking about things. So like, to get to this positive place, like what are you seeing that you wish other people were seeing?
The experimentation that I see with the tools amongst people building software, I find to be very exciting, and it's hard work, but seeing communities form in like group chats, for example, where folks are like, "Hey, this really works well for me. I built a harness for this," or like, "Has anyone tried out Gas City?" Or like there's all sorts of stuff like this. And I think the community formation and how like organic that's been drives a lot of innovation quietly behind the scenes, and that part is really cool. Now I will read some of this stuff, and there are people who post, like, I'll shout out Dan Shapiro at Glowforge, who will post really interesting tools, or Jesse Vincent, and usually I kind of sit back for a few months, and then I see like what's solidified as something that all these people are using, and then I pick it up. But like there's this sort of trickle, and I'll teach my students about it. I think people should start thinking about what it looks like if software becomes very cheap to produce for almost any purpose. So long as you've got a vision for what it needs to do. I am inspired by one of my former students, Dan Swenson. He's got a career as a military special forces operator prior to being an MBA student. He doesn't write code. In fact, he'll tell you openly he's never written any Python code, but he's got 5 or 6 projects out of the 30 or so that he's done over the last year that are generating like meaningful value for whatever his goal was. And one of them is like, he helped his sister with like a phone app for some sports medicine stuff. Another would be some of the things he was thinking about for private equity. Like he's a pretty wide-ranging guy, but for someone like him, and you listen to him talk, sounds like a software architect. He's there are lots of people like him where if they can define a problem well, they have the grit to push through, they're going to sort of blaze a trail for the rest of us to be builders. Now, that's going to come with a whole bunch of compliments. If you tell a chief information security officer that their entire firm's sales force is going to be coding, they're not excited about that to start. So we got compliments to build as well. So anyway, I think like blending the East Coast skepticism, saying like things take a while, they can be challenging, with a sense of like West Coast optimism, and then you end up as a Midwestern economist like me.
Yeah, a Chicago person. You're right in the middle. Okay, I mean that's exciting. Thank you so much for being part of the show. And
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and for any listeners, check out Daniel's papers, research, Twitter presence, all those.
Thanks.
The Economics of Work is brought to you by Rebellion Labs, workforce data for research and benchmarking. If you enjoyed, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It'll help us reach other curious listeners. I'm your host, Ben Zweig. Our producer is Cole Wagner. Thanks for listening.